Hi there, listener. It's audio producer Robin. Carlos and Sean are away this week, but we'll have more Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean next week. Today, we're re-airing a podcast where Carlos and Sean pull back the curtain on sports journalism and what it takes to write a profile on Kirk Gibson.
Hey, folks, welcome to Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean. Carlos, it's good to see you, man. I know we talked last week. I think it was in New York for the NCAA tournament. The week before, you were out. Maybe it's just all the week before that, I think you were in Lakeland. I was in Columbus, maybe Chicago. I don't know. It's all running together. It feels like we haven't seen or talked to each other in a while, even though we just did last week. But you know what I mean? This time of year, this gets a little crazy. We got the Wings and the Pistons. They're close to wrapping up their seasons. Maybe one of these days, Carlos, they'll play beyond April. And we got the Tigers about to start theirs. What's the other team we have? The Lions? There's so much buzz, but we'll talk about
Lions.
We'll talk about the Lions.
Beaters out in Phoenix this week.
Oh my goodness! Yeah, the GM meetings are going on out in Arizona. The great Dave Burkett's out there. He's got us covered. When he gets back, he's going to join us, and we can put a bow on the free agency and get into some draft talk and all that sort of thing. But I thought maybe we could do something a little bit different today, if it's okay with you. And I know we had in our pre-show meeting, I asked you to trust me.
That's a generous term for what that was.
Well,
yes.
I mean, what else you want me to call it? A gab session, whatever. I asked you to trust me a little bit because I want to talk about the idea of story and storytelling in our business and how it's changed. And what really got me thinking about this was the story that you wrote maybe not from Lakeland, but that you reported in Lakeland and then probably finished when you got back to Michigan. And it's about Kirk Gibson. And it was a terrific story, a great story, actually. And
thank you.
For the listeners out there that haven't seen it, the headline is Kirk Gibson changed baseball 35 years ago in L.A., but he never wanted to leave the Detroit Tigers. I think we're missing maybe we're not. I don't know. You know how the headline writers are. In any case, it's not the kind of piece we do a lot of these days, Carlos. I mean, I rarely do them. I know you don't do them very often. The Free Press sports department doesn't do them like we used to, just journalism in general. And so when they drop, when we get one, when we see one, to me, they stand out even more. And before we get into the piece itself and to Kirk Gibson, because I feel like you got some stuff we hadn't seen before, I just wanted you to talk about why you wanted to do this, how it kind of turned into this longer story. It's not just a quick column or your couple of thoughts on Gibson or whatever. It really delves into some really important sports history in our area. And I'm just curious kind of how it came to be.
Well, the true reason of why it came to be is because I grew up in L.A. as a Dodger fan, and the night he hit that home run in Game 1 against the A's in 1988, I was in the Forum, the Great Western Forum, I don't know if it's still called that, watching the Kings and Flyers, watching Wayne Gretzky's Kings beat Ron Hextall's Flyers, and it was a big deal in L.A., as you can imagine. Such a memorable home run, such a dramatic home run. And but the reason that it happened is, and I don't know if you do this, Sean, but I try to kind of look for anniversary dates, and that's one of the great things about Detroit. There's so much history here. It's always good to revisit, momentous events, things that kind of change the course of a team's trajectory, whatever it might be. And it happened to be 35 years ago that he left the Tigers in free agency and signed with the Dodgers. It happened on January 29th, I believe, is when he signed with the Dodgers. And at first I was a little bit upset because I didn't realize that it was happening at that time and so quickly. And I'm like, I missed the date. It would have been great to run it, hey, 35 years ago on this day, But the other thing was I thought, well, it's hard to get a hold of Kirk Gibson. He is not really out there, bouncing around and doing media availability and stuff. He works for the Tigers, but you can see him more at the games and track him down. And he's not really looking for publicity these days, for the most part. So it actually worked out that going down to Lakeland for a week, I could do a few things, but the main thing I wanted to do was to talk to Gibson about it. His journey, everything that went on. A lot of it's already been reported, but there's also it doesn't hurt to kind of relive or revisit what happened. And sometimes the players or the people involved have a fresh perspective on what happened. So that's really what it was. Just looking for anniversary dates. I did that with, we had the, what was it? The 25th anniversary, I think, of the brawl at Joe Louis with the Avs and the Wings a few years ago. I talked to McCarty about that. So that's kind of one of the little.
So you're a history buff.
Yeah, one of the cheats in journalism is look for fun anniversary dates. And people love to talk about it. Actually, that's usually the case.
But I think you're selling yourself short here a little bit. I mean, I understand that. And look, you go down to spring training in your role as a columnist, you're normally going to go down. You got to produce at least one column a day, sometimes maybe more. And there's value in that, right?
One column a day. What kind of boss would you be, man?
No. I mean, yeah. And look, there's obviously a lot of value in that. Our colleague Jeff Seidel, a columnist who just loves baseball more than just about anybody I know, goes down, and that's what he does. He tries to capture that. You went down, understanding that he's already been down there for a few weeks, and this is maybe I don't want to get too much into kind of the making the sausage part of journalism, but you're trying to figure out, okay, what can I do a little bit differently, right? I know that you're working on another piece. I don't want to give it away here. That'll be out sometime probably later in April. Let's just say it'll be attached to a pretty big golf tournament, and it has to do with you playing golf and with a surprise guest. And we'll let the readers figure that one out for themselves when it happens or when it drops. But yeah, no, Carlos, you had to figure out what can be different, right? Because you don't go down to spring training every year and spend several weeks, and so you want to figure something out. And I think to the larger point is that there's still room for us to do that, right? And I think it's necessary to do that. It's easy to get, and we can talk about this too. It's easy to get wrapped up in, especially as a columnist. All right, what's my take? And how hot does it need to be, and how opinionated do it, right? I mean, it's easy to get wrapped up into that. You got to have something to say, but to step back, I think, and my guess is, I don't want to give away proprietary stuff about how well that piece did, but my guess is that it did really, really well, right? And that you had feedback in a way you don't, unless people are just really angry at you for something you've written and they're disagreeing with you, but. Did it surprise you how it hit? And is it a good reminder that that stuff really matters still?
Yeah, it surprised me a little bit. To the one listener out there, we have a lot of advanced technology that lets us look at a lot of numbers and metrics and everything, and it did well across the board on a lot of the key metrics. And I was, Sean, I mean, you and I, we always do our best. And you have one of the great lines I've ever heard about writing, that you don't say you like writing, you say you like having written. And it can be a little torturous, right? To craft these stories and opinions and whatever it might be. But this one, I was happy with it. I liked. To me, the one thing about these features, it's more of a feature than a column. That's definitely in a column voice, but to me, it's all about the planning, and what is it? What's the general thrust of what I'm writing, and then if you get the source subject or subjects to be more forthcoming, that really helps the story. So it all kind of lined up. But I was really happy that it did well. Oh my God, everybody! It was just so much positive feedback. Some of our former colleagues too chimed in, which is really nice. That's the highest compliment you can get from people you respect, who are maybe out of the business or retired, and they said they really enjoyed it. So that's always fun.
Well,
and
you can give us some names. We're among family here. Who'd you hear from? Mick McCabe?
Nancy Laughlin was the one person that. I guess she's the one person who's not working for us anymore. She's a longtime
former news editor. News
editor. She was just just
and
an
a big baseball fan, by the way.
Oh, was she? Yeah, you're right. You're right. She was.
Yeah, she was a huge baseball fan.
She had her Tigers pennant.
That's nice. No, that's a nice kind of validation. Obviously, writers. It's funny. I was at a journalism class recently, talking with young students, and they wanted to know. We were talking about writing and how you get better, and so the internal battle. I said, so many writers, especially journalists. It's harder for me to speak for novelists. I've known a few nonfiction writers, but mostly journalists, and so many journalists have sort of a mix of confidence, borderlining on arrogance, with deep insecurity, and those two things go at each other internally constantly. So you do a piece like this, and even at your age, you've been doing this a long time. It's still nice to get some feedback, but just in general, I like, you worry. Look, we could do 100 podcasts about the state of our business and where we're at and what we produce, but it's just, I read this piece and I just thought it's nice. I know we do this on the news side from time to time, but in sports, there's so much feeding the beast. We have 8 teams that we're responsible for covering, and not the primary teams, and the 4 pro teams, and then the 4, basketball, football at Michigan State. And then lots of other stuff sort of around that too. And just feeding that sometimes doesn't allow for this. So when you see it again, like I said at the top of the podcast, it really stands out. I want to talk about the story itself and how you structured it. And I want to ask you about this lead, which I think is great. But before I do real quickly, I wonder, in the way you decided to, the fact that you wanted to write about that he didn't want to leave Detroit, I thought was really smart. He went to LA, he hits the homer, but he really didn't want to leave Detroit. Obviously, he had roots here. He's Michigan, grew up in Waterford and played at Michigan State as a football player. And so that's all well known. But the fact that he didn't want to leave Detroit, I thought felt sort of fresh and new, because there was I don't know if you saw this, Carlos, there's a pretty incredible profile of him that was written. It's the best thing I've ever read about him before I saw your piece. Within the last 10 years, written by S.L. Price of Sports Illustrated, about his personality and just his intensity. And it's an intense piece, and it captures parts of him that I don't know that he wanted to be captured, right? It's a very raw piece, and about how he's sort of changed and how he used to treat people and all that sort of thing. You largely stayed away from that, and you related it to his Detroit to LA journey, and then he wanted to go. So I thought that was really, really clever, because sometimes when you're writing about somebody later in life and so much has been written about them, that's not easy either, right?
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of history, a lot of source material. And the funny thing about the S.L. Price, he works for Sports Illustrated or used to. I'm not sure if he's still working for them, but I try to stay away from too much research when it comes to that kind of stuff, because I don't want it to influence what I'm writing. I don't want it to get in my head of, are you copying what this person is doing? Are you riffing on it? Are you, do I need to include that? It's you can get inside your head a little too much as a writer if you read too much background, I think, in my opinion. By the way, S.L. Price, when I was in college or somewhere around there, he wrote one of my all-time favorite features for Sports Illustrated when the old Montreal Forum was closing. And he wrote about it. He had a great take of saying, and I think he's done this with the other pieces of the ghosts of the Forum. And he starts it off in the voice of Howie Morenz, a great Canadians Hall of Famer in the 30s, and that he's dead, but he's talking from the grave, basically talking about all the different things that have happened in the Forum in the last, whatever it was, 70 years that it's been there. And it was just it's the first time I had read a take like that in a feature, but it was just, if you ever find it, look for it, S.L. Price, Howie Morenz, the Montreal Forum, or I think it was like early 90s that it came out. Just fantastic. But but yeah, you do have to, you can't just kind of go back and rehash everything. And I thought the value with this story at least was going to be that Gibson hasn't really talked about that in a while. So it's something that even if some of it's been written or like when Price is written, it's been 10 years. It's been a while. Most people have not seen that story or may not remember it. And even from the research I did, Gibson had slightly different takes now than he did when I've read other pieces back. Certainly, I went through our archives when it was fresher, when people were talking to him about it, when he was with the Dodgers and the different anecdotes. So he's a human. Your memory changes, your perspective changes over time. So this is Kirk Gibson now at age early 60s. What he's remembering about something that happened, almost half a century ago now. But it's always, and as a sports fan, it's always fun to kind of go back and talk to people about those amazing moments.
Well, yeah, their perspective changes. I don't remember what year this was. You'll have to forgive me. It was the year Jack Morris got into the Hall of Fame. And I went to DC to talk to him, and he agreed to meet me in his hotel lobby. We talked for a while, and I remember sitting there with him and him kind of sort of apologizing, right? And saying, yeah, I did a lot of stuff that I regret. And he was kind of swinging back from being really emotional. I think he finally gotten in, right, to this regret. And, and I wrote all that. And that perspective can make for a really compelling piece, to your point about Gibson. But in terms of what you wrote this week, for the Free Press about him, your lead is, you could probably just stopped it after your lead, right? It says a lot about who he is, and it's Kirk Gibson doesn't want you to read this, which is a great lead, which reminds me, it sort of harkens back to this, the immersion journalism, the narrative journalism, the new journalism sort of style that started in the 60s with Tom Wolfe and a bunch of other writers, maybe even the late 50s, but 60s, Gay Talese.
It was 60s, yeah.
But that sentence reminded me of something you might read out of Esquire, 30 years ago, that era. So it's a nostalgic kind of way that you started the story. And it's also a very compelling way, right? I don't know if you've seen that idea someplace else that just seeped in, or it's just your view of the world that everybody's, cynical and out for themselves, a very Hobbesian kind of view of the world. I don't know. But but fill us in here. Where did that lead come from?
It came from, when you do a story like this, you spend so much time reporting it and thinking about it. It's a lot of information that you've got to distill, and it's like it's like a piece of clay. And like, how am I going to shape this into something? I got a lot of stuff here, and I always try to think when it comes to the leads, the starts of the stories, kind of thematically, like what's the theme here? And at first I thought the theme was, talking about something that happened 35 years ago and the Tigers leaving, the Tigers not wanting to. But the funny thing was, the ironic thing was that the reason I write that is because he comes up to me the next day after I talked to him in a bowling alley for a couple of hours. And he says, hey, I don't want you to write that. He's worried that it's going to come off that it's all about him, and maybe came off a little whiny, whatever it was, that he's talking about himself. And like I said, Gibson does not look for publicity these days. And he could get as much as he wants, especially because of the Parkinson's that he's dealing with. And at first I'm like, whoa,
Whoa, right. Whoa is exactly right. Like, you spend 2 hours with him, you don't want him, and he's saying, hey, don't write it. It's still Kirk Gibson, right? And he's still now, he's an opposing figure. And I want to hear how it happened that he became okay with it, or did you threaten him? But before we do, let's take a quick break and pay some bills, and we'll be right back with how you told Kirk Gibson how it was going to be. We'll be right back with more Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean. Welcome back to Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean. Okay, what did you do to the imposing Kirk Gibson, the growling, menacing stubble-faced Kirk Gibson to sway him to say, hey, wait a second. Did you tell him, what'd you say? I'm Carlos Monarez and this is how it's going to be. What'd you say?
Yeah. I mean,
because that can be an awkward conversation, right? Because you want to honor to some degree. But so how'd you figure that out?
Well, you and I have been at this for a while, Sean, and it's not my first rodeo. It's not the first time someone's told me, I don't want to do this, or I said too much or whatever. I wasn't expecting him to say that. So I just talked him into saying, like, listen, I think this is something that, one, people are going to be very interested in the story about you, but also, it's going to help people. The Parkinson's stuff is going to help people because we talked about that and how he's dealing with his illness. And it's been very impressive. I mean, one day I was supposed to play golf with him and I didn't because he'd been tired from doing too much activity the day before. And that's one of the key things that they say for dealing with Parkinson's is physical activity and staying, active. And I think Gibson may overdo it a little bit because he does just about anything he can. And so I think he realized this is an opportunity to yes, it's going to be a lot about his playing career and the breakup with the Tigers and all that stuff, and he didn't even talk about with the Dodgers at the home run. He didn't even talk about it that much, but he did talk about the Parkinson's and he's one of his key messages is don't hide from it. You have to take it, face it head on, don't shrink from it, deal with it, attack it. And that's Gibson, right? Like always attacking, always being aggressive, that's who he was as a player. That's who he was in the locker room. That's just his personality. And I think that's the kind of thing that does give you inspiration, whether you're dealing with, specifically Parkinson's or other diseases or serious medical conditions. I think you can take comfort in thinking, hey, this is a guy, this icon in sports, certainly in Detroit, who's been dealt a bad hand, and this is how he's dealing with it. And, I hope that some people did gain inspiration from that and not let the disease control them, but rather, meeting it head on and doing as much as you can.
Well, that's really smart to sort of push it that way. But so should your lead have been Kirk Gibson doesn't want you to read this, but I changed his mind and now he's okay with you reading this?
Kirk Gibson has nothing on me. It's all about me.
Would that have been more accurate?
No, this is the argument Sean and I always have, dear listener, is Sean thinks I should have probably written it as I got Kirk Gibson to change his mind about he hates it when I start sentences with I, so that would have been the perfect Carlos call.
No, not necessarily. So he agrees, obviously, and you roll from there and get into the writing process. It's funny about that home run with the Dodgers. I think what makes that home run so memorable, other than obviously the circumstances, the relief pitcher, the fact that the A's were so heavily favored, all that sort of stuff. I mean, the Dodgers are real underdogs, and they are not often underdogs. I mean, they're one of the great franchises in American sports history, but at that time they were. But to me, and I think for so many people, it's just the emotion and the way he pumped his fist, right? So he's pumping the fist. So there's that Gibson intensity as he's sort of limping. So you got competing parts of his body, right? On the one hand, you can see the fury in that arm swing, that fist pump. And the other, he's, kind of an aging player who's hanging on for dear life and limping around the bases. It's all in the larger context of the World Series at a time when the World Series was, I hate to say this, at least nationally, a lot more meaningful to our culture. And that's another reason it stands out, right? Especially for those of us that remember that time. Obviously, the Tigers got into the World Series, Carlos. It would be huge around here, and maybe if they got in with some transcendent players in the game, the Derek Jeter type players, it would resonate across the country. But do you remember that? I mean, do you remember how baseball felt back then nationally?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you don't because you were right in the middle of it, and it's hard for you to remove because you were in LA and you love the Dodgers, but I don't know. Did you have any sense of how big it was? Not just for the Oakland and LA, but for the rest of the country?
Well, not right away when it happened, but I think probably in the next few years. I mean, I was in high school when that happened, but as you would see around the World Series time every year, they would replay that home run a lot. And it was like, they're really replaying this a lot. And the Dodgers have always been kind of like the Yankees, where a lot of people hate them, just because they're this powerhouse team with unlimited, budgets, and usually they get a lot of star players. That was funny because that team did not have a lot of star players. So it was
one pitcher. The pitcher was their star player, right? Well, Gibson, I guess, but
Gibson. They had Mike Scioscia was really good, but other than that, it was you got.
And people knew Mike Scioscia, but Hershiser was and then ended up becoming a bigger star because of his performance in that series, right? But
yeah, he had an incredible year, and Gibson had an incredible year, but they were not. I'm not even. Who knows? I mean, what they were even picked to even make the playoffs. Again, there was no wild card back then, and
those A's teams had stars on them that went way beyond baseball, right? Then this is back when baseball was full of players like that. But Jose Canseco, right? Mark McGwire, Ricky Henderson. I mean, even to some degree, Dennis Eckersley, the relief pitcher. And I'm trying to think who their ace was. Dave Stewart, maybe. Jose Canseco alone, right? Then you add Ricky Henderson, and then Mark McGwire, right? I mean, those three guys were. It's hard to think of baseball that way now, but with guys all over national commercials, right? Just these, to some degree, even having a little bit of paparazzi following them, especially Canseco.
Oh yeah, he was in the nightclubs for sure.
Yeah, no, it was crazy. I mean, this was in Oakland too, and obviously San Francisco, Oakland's a huge market, but Oakland's. It's funny. Oakland's always been considered.
Don't tell Billy Bean that.
It's always been considered a small market team. Yeah, but it's part of one of the 3 or 4 largest metropolitan areas in the country. So it's kind of funny, that dynamic. Anyway, I just
you can't. And don't forget this that and I think it was in the SL Price. It might have been the SL Price, or I forget where I read it. But after he hit that home run, one of the assistant coaches put a piece of tape on his locker over his name, and instead of Gibson, it said Roy Hobbs. Because The Natural, the movie with Robert Redford, that kind of mirrors what Gibson did, had just come out, I think, a few years before that, 84 or something. So it was kind of fresh in people's minds as kind of like storybook, aging player, hits a dramatic home run in the World Series kind of thing. And he did it in real life. And I remember, the funny thing is I asked a lot of people about that home run, and people can't remember where they were. I think that's the funny thing, Sean, is it's become so ingrained in sports culture that even people who were in Los Angeles at the time, unless you were watching it on TV or at the stadium, I wasn't. It's hard to remember exactly like where you were, what happened, how you felt in the moment. I'm sure I saw it on a television replay when I got home and I was watching local sports highlights or whatever it was. And they're like, oh, Lord, because the funny thing was I was at the Forum watching this game. All they did was announce I think it was that they won, the Dodgers won, and they would always say from Dodger Stadium, they announced, they may not even be given the score. Maybe they did, but there were 0 TVs around. Nobody knew. Nobody had radios or internet, obviously. So it wasn't until maybe I heard it in the car on the way home and talk radio or something like that. But it was, it's just become part of this mythology of sports, right? Where were you when it happened? A lot of people I know can't remember exactly where they were when it happened.
Yeah, I don't know that I remember. I remember watching it though, and I remember loving it, not because I love the Dodgers, but it was the A's were a juggernaut, right?
Yeah,
and so you're kind of rooting. I'm sure lots of people love them, but I didn't, and so I just wanted to see anybody beat them. So I didn't take any joy in that home run because I was rooting or had wanted to see the Dodgers win necessarily. It was quite the opposite. And you know how that motivation is. I was just a fan of baseball back then. Not that I'm not now, but there were some other homers too that that I probably enjoyed more. Kirby Puckett did a homer for the Twins.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say in the way, and I love those Twins teams. I'm not sure why. The Joe Carter, I think you mentioned him, but getting back to Gibson for a second, and baseball and this idea, and you touched on this, and I remember this happened. I remember all these stories at the time. Bringing his mentality, how serious he was, and he didn't like that. He thought the Dodgers were too loose and clowning around, and that kind of thing today. People would side eye you in baseball, right? Like that it doesn't matter, that you can't do that kind of rah stuff. You can either pitch or throw or hit, and you know what I mean. We don't think about baseball in the psychological terms that we used to. What do you think of that? Could a player change a culture in a clubhouse like that, a single player in today's game?
I think so. I think if the player has enough, bona fides, and they have to have, I think, the support from the buy-in from other players, from the manager, from the general manager.
But he made it so, right, Carlos? I mean, he was going after Lasorda too, right? He didn't care.
Lasorda was
Tommy Lasorda, for the listener, right? The manager of the Dodgers at the time.
Yeah, there are some wild stories about Tommy Lasorda, and I think kind of some of that came from him.
He might as well have been part of the Rat Pack.
I don't know the background of this, but I'm guessing that at the time, I mean, and Peter O'Malley, the Dodgers owner at the time, specifically calls Gibson and says, I want you, and their general manager, Fred Clare, I'm sure took his marching orders from O'Malley. And it's like, we're not going to go get this guy, and he's going to have an MVP season, and we're not going to fall in line with him. We're going to let, some relief pitchers, mess with him, or some shenanigans going on. They knew that they needed something different. I'm sure at the time that they didn't have a bunch of stars on the team. They needed somebody to bring more intensity out of the team. And you see it. I think you see it in all sports. Baseball's different. And when I talked to Alan Trammell about that, he did say, he had that football mentality. He could be prickly, and he said it's that football mentality doesn't really usually translate to baseball. It's not common. So he was one of the few guys who could make it work in the clubhouse. And, I don't know. I wasn't in the clubhouse with Gibson then. I think he was probably overall a likable guy, a respected guy. He worked hard. He's one of these guys who he made himself a better player. He wasn't some superstar. I mean, he played one season of college baseball at Michigan State, and that made him a first-round pick. But he had to make himself into it. He, never had a good arm, but he took lessons from, tutoring, basically mentoring from Al Kaline. He worked at being a better player. Sparky Anderson helped. And I think they looked at that. I think the Dodgers looked at, hey, he's coming from a really successful Tigers team. Can we transplant some of that? And but
it worked.
Give them credit. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to go against a whole locker room or clubhouse. Even when you know better. Even when it's hard to change. People talk about that too much these days. And that's one of the things I really hate is when people are like, oh, the culture. Talk to Kirk Gibson about changing the culture. That's hard. I mean, I think if it's a concerted effort from the top down, even then it's difficult to do it. But you need leaders in the clubhouse. Guys who are willing to take it in the teeth and stand up and say, this is BS. People like Kirk Gibson. It's hard to do that.
It's funny. Jim Leland used to downplay that, right? Culture. He used to talk about, and the idea of momentum and the psychology for him. Hey, the momentum is your next day starter, right? I mean, that's how it works in
baseball. That's what it is these days. Yeah,
it's true. And he downplayed a lot of that. And it was always interesting to me because I thought that was sort of self-effacing because that was one of the things he was so good at. Something, obviously strategy, and he understood the game and all that really well. But he was so good at walking through and sort of sizing up and understanding and trying to, because let's face it, yes, mechanics matter, the analytics, the video, the studies, the angle, everything. We talk about launch angles all the time, right? If you can't relax when you're in the batter's box, you're toast. That's still true. Even though that kind of language is fading from the game a little bit, or at least how we write about and cover the game. That's the other thing that made it so interesting to me when I was reading your Gibson piece. I was just thinking about all that's changed. And your point about football not translating to Alan Trammell, yeah, for sure. But did you think about that though when you were writing this and reporting this, of just about the way we thought about baseball back then and talked about baseball, even covered baseball, versus how we write and cover it now?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It was, and that was one of the decisions I made to not include in the story, was more stuff about Lasorda and the culture of those teams. A lot of it's hearsay, but certainly LA journalists at that time could tell you some crazy things. And it was a different time. Now we do have so many more analytics and the money is so huge. I mean, what did he signed for, I think, $4.5 million for 3 years.
Yeah, that's something. That's shocking when you read that. Yeah, no, for sure.
Oh, it was something crazy. Like he had some quote somewhere, I remember reading something about how it was the Dodgers were giving him another, I don't know. I forget, it was the Tigers or the Dodgers were offering like $500,000 more or something like that. And it was like, oh, it'd be crazy not to take this, and $500,000. I mean, it's like Miguel Cabrera trips over $500,000 outside of the clubhouse every day. So, the money's so outrageous that, you don't have to really tell players much about how to take the game seriously. I do think that we are missing that component. I don't know if it's a football thing necessarily. Certainly it was with Gibson, but just that leadership aspect, though. I'm willing to stick my neck out, call guys out, tell them this is wrong. We got to do things better. We got to practice better. We got to play better. We got to take things more seriously sometimes. Nobody was going to match Kirk Gibson's intensity. And frankly, this is when he got to the Dodgers, this is what we heard, was he's a football player, and I didn't like him for that reason. I didn't know much about him really, other than he'd been a great player for the Tigers. But I didn't like that. I didn't like that he may have seemed like a little self-serious or whatever. You wanted baseball players smoking you wanted like Keith Hernandez smoking in the dugout and trying to look at people in the crowd and all that sort of thing. That's what you wanted, right? Well, it's. I mean, having played baseball, I mean, it's a very methodical, deliberate game. You just can't be that intense. And I'll tell you a quick little funny thing that happened.
But he was.
It's been almost 10 years now since this happened. But my team, my college team, Cal State Fullerton, it's a baseball school. And they were playing. They got sent out to the Super Regional at Louisville, and Louisville's baseball program was on the rise. And the coach decided to say, "Hey, we're going to lean into. We have a really, I don't know if Teddy Bridgewater was on the team then or whatever, but we're going to lean into how good our football team is. We're going to bring that kind of football intensity to our baseball team." Well, Cal State Fullerton's won 4 College World Series titles. They know something about how to play well without having to be that kind of intense team. They go play in the Super Regional, and that Louisville team was intense. The pitcher's intense. He's pointing at the dugout. Fullerton beats them. They go to the World Series. So next year, wouldn't you know, Louisville, same thing, right? And they're hosting another Super Regional. They get another team, UC Santa Barbara, from our conference, from Big West. Wouldn't you know, Santa Barbara beats them. And I think they started relaxing on the whole football intensity because it doesn't translate. You just cannot bring that. You have to play with
unless they're playing
control.
above their talent, right? Unless they're playing above their talent. I mean, that Louisville could, Santa Barbara and Fullerton may just been more talented teams, and Louisville was trying.
They weren't. They were huge underdogs in those games, but they know how to play baseball. These teams have been they're California baseball teams are much different than Southern. Louisville's kind of in the South, but other than the power SEC teams,
Vanderbilt, right? I mean. But
Vanderbilt's great. Yeah,
I mean, that's just a matter of getting guys.
But it doesn't translate. I mean, the point is, it's hard to translate that and I'm talking football. It's like pitch to pitch intensity. You can't have that. You can have an at bat.
No, sometimes closers have it, but they're out there for an inning, right? Or maybe one out or one batter of a next inning.
Absolutely.
And maybe they come in early and face one batter in the eighth. Mariano Rivera used to do that. Although he was serious more than I think of it since. But no, your point's a good one. I tell you what, though, it makes for great stories. It made for a great story with what you just did with the one you just told about Kirk Gibson. And I think we're just drawn to that real quickly. Think about Dan Campbell. Look, if you win if you have an NFL team and you're a head coach and you're in a town, usually the NFL team is the favorite team. It's just football in our culture. And if you win, you're going to be lionized. You're going to be beloved in a lot of ways. And I'm sure that's what Bill Belichick is for New England. But if you win and you're Dan Campbell, you're going to be, I don't know if he's going to do it or not, but if he were to win with that personality, with this town, that will be a different relationship these Detroiters, Michiganders have with Campbell, the New Englanders have with Belichick, right? Because of what you're talking about. And that's what you got with Gibson in your story, right? It's not that Campbell is intense in the same way Gibson is, but just there's something about that connects that lends itself to storytelling. And I'm glad you did it, man. It's like I said, it's a reminder that that this is what we can still do, and it's nice to see that we can still do this. And I hope you feel good about what you did, and I hope that we'll see that a little bit more from you from time to time.
Yeah, and you know what? And credit, I'm going to be a total suck up, but credit to our sports editor, Kirkland Crawford, who, approved this and thought it's a good idea to do it. The same thing when I went out to talk to Stafford when he was at the Rams and the Lions were going out there to play, giving me the time to go out and, report it, talk to people, and that's, I think most journalists, it's the kind of, you can be inspired and driven by a lot of different things, but I like to do these kind of stories. And when you're right, we don't do them quite often. They take a lot of time.
They do.
And you need the support from your editors to make that happen. And Kirk's been great about that. So email Kirkland Crawford and tell him you want more of these kind of stories from people like me and Sean. So we'll
and our colleague Jeff Seidel, obviously, who does them probably more than anybody on our sports staff anyway, and
right.
He's very good at them. But in any case, all right, let's take one more quick break. Come back with the favorite thing and get everybody out of here. We'll be right back with more Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean. Welcome back to Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean. All right, my man, let's wrap this up. What you got for your favorite thing?
My favorite thing is kind of a dumb thing, but it's a simple thing. As you know, Sean, I was out there in Florida for a week or so, and then I got sick. And my first cold in 3 years pre-COVID hit pretty hard. And just a cold, nothing beyond that. But it was hard and laid me up for a while, for a couple of weeks from doing any kind of serious activity. And I like to work out. I really enjoy going to my local gym. And today was the first day this week I went back for the first time in 3 weeks. And one of the things I realized, as much as I really enjoy the physical, you and I have boring life. We don't move. We just sit at tables and look at screens and whatever, think great thoughts, but we don't have a lot of physical activity. If we have,
I don't know about the thinking great thoughts, but yeah.
Well, you do. But if we had an Apple Watch, it'd be screaming at us all the time saying, get up, move, move, move. So it was fun to go back to work out, but it was also nice to see the people. And I forgot all my little classmates that I, take classes with and exercise classes. And so it was fun to see people back at my gym. I really enjoyed it. I told my wife I was really looking forward to it. And I'm glad to be back on the path to better health with more exercise. So that was my favorite thing.
Oh, well, that's great. I'm glad you're feeling better. We definitely miss you. It's no fun when you're under the weather for sure. My favorite thing is, real quick, I was in a journalism class at the University of Michigan Dearborn, investigative journalism class, taught by one of our top editors now, but who was one of the great investigative journalists anywhere you could find for a long, long time, and Jim Schaefer. And, I did used to do some investigative work. And in fact, he and I did a piece about a track coach in Tecumseh, and we were talking about this in the class, who high school track coach in Tecumseh, Michigan, who had a hot tub and would invite, high schoolers over for hot tub parties, and you can just let your imagination go from there. In any case, he's in prison. And as Jim pointed out in the class,
skip to the chase. He's in prison.
No, I know.
Hot tub to prison.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sorry for getting off on that aside, but it's just the part what I really enjoyed was just talking to the young folks, that they're young folks that still want to get into journalism. I went around the room and asked toward the end of the class, everybody was in there because they want to get into journalism in some form. It was a couple of people interested in sports writers. Somebody wanted to get into fashion writing. Somebody wanted to get into broadcasting, but they all wanted to go into journalism. And that was heartening. And it was just fun. We had a really fun conversation. They sort of dissected a piece and had a lot of questions about a column I wrote about my family history with dementia and my cousin Brady, who died last summer, and they put it up on a big projector screen and were asking me about this sentence and that sentence and this sentence, and that was partly what was sort of inspiring to me, because I want to talk about your Kirk Gibson piece today. But it was fun to kind of go back and say why I did this. Sometimes you can't explain. In any case, my favorite thing was by far the fact that young people still want to come into this crazy business, and they still want to go tell stories and still want to expose wrongdoing and bring different voices and opinions, and it's pretty critical to what we do as a society, or what we try to do. And sometimes you think, God, why would anybody want to get into this business? The financial difficulties, the way it's so polarized. But listening to the young folks, gives you a little bit of faith. So that was my favorite thing.
Let me ask you, I want to see if your experience was similar to mine when I've talked to journalism classes, but was their number one question or most common question, how do you get a job?
No. Their questions for me were all based on writing and how I would do something and how you get better. And,
Oh, wow.
it was mostly about writing and getting better and sentence structure and, well, how did you come up with this? And the problem is you don't know sometimes. But it wasn't about how to get a job. So but I have had that before in classes. But anyway, all right, my man, it's good to see you. I'm glad you're feeling better. Thanks for letting us dig into your fabulous piece on Kirk Gibson. And I will see you. I'm sure. Who knows when I'll see you? I don't know. Baseball's about to start here, so.
Opening day next week.
Yeah, we'll probably see you at opening day for sure. And, maybe before, we'll see. In any case, we need to thank, who do we need to thank, man?
We need to thank Robin Channer, our intrepid producer, does all the hard work. And our executive producers, Kirkland Crawford, the aforementioned. We're getting, Anjanette Delgado is not going to, I heard she's not happy. She's not getting a lot or enough mentions. And she's the interim editor on top of that. So she can just snap her fingers and we're gone. And it's just
that's all right. You and Aldous we'll hang out. We'll talk on the phone. It's okay. We'll be good.
It'll just be dead air from now on.
Yeah,
she's the most important one in this whole thing. But right. No. She's the second most important, because who's the most important?
The listeners. We want to thank you for spending time with us, for joining us, for putting up with us. We are grateful. We are also, look, if you're already listening, you already know this, but let's just say this again. You can find us wherever you find your favorite podcasts, Spotify, Apple. When you get there, please subscribe, rate us, tell us what you think. Until next week, Carlos, when we'll be back for more Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean, maybe you can find another guy who's was once angry and intense, who helped turn a franchise around and dig into his life story. That would be great. I'll look forward to that.
I will too.
Okay. All right. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week. All right.